Hey guys, it's Mr. Truan here. I am going to give you my own version of the first cat. So the skill that we are looking at today is comparing different systems of government. And I know that when I compare two things, I'm looking for similarities, and I'm looking for differences. So if I'm comparing an apple and an orange, one similarity is they're both types of fruit. Difference obviously is that one is red and one is orange. And that is the key skill that I'm going to show you today. And in the process of showing you how to complete that key skill, I'm going to use two different systems of government as an example. Okay, and the two governments I'm looking at today, one is Sri Lanka, which is a little island just off the south coast of India. And I'm going to be looking at Australia, which is a much bigger island south of India. One thing that both these countries have in common off the bat is that they both were at one stage under the governance of the United Kingdom of Britain. And so many elements of their system of government have been borrowed from Britain. So that history is really important. I'm throwing up this Venn diagram just to get us all in this comparative mind frame. We all know that when we complete a Venn diagram, we have our similarities in the middle where it overlaps and our differences on the outside. So at the end of this presentation, we're going to come back to this Venn diagram. This is what I want you to have at the end of the process. This shows if you're looking to compare something, if you can complete a Venn diagram, you've effectively compared two things. Okay. So then what am I looking for when I compare systems of government? So the first thing is I need to be able to identify the type of government. So I need to be able to say whether or not this is a democracy. Is it a dictatorship? Is it a monarchy? So these different types of government, there's more detail within these categories that I can go into when when I am comparing, but that's sort of my base level. I'm going to look at which individuals or institutions have power. So is there a president, a prime minister? Is there, if I'm a monarchy, maybe there is a king or queen? Who has power? And then where does this power come from? Is it given to them by the people through voting? Is there a constitution involved? Perhaps it is the army which controls the system of government in this country. And lastly, I want to look at whether rights and freedoms are protected. So is there right to freedom of speech? Do I have freedom of the press? Can I assemble, protest, join a political party? So these are the four sort of key pillars that I'm looking for when I compare. All right, let's start off. So Sri Lanka's government is called the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. Okay, that's really important here. Obviously, this keyword democracy is in here. Socialist has its sort of historical linkages with the writings that led to communism. This just means that they've got a heavy emphasis on welfare and distributing sort of wealth and resources evenly. So off the bat, I'm fairly certain that, like Australia, which is a democracy, that there is one thing in common. I have to look to see whether or not it's actually a democracy, but for the moment, this is a good start. This word republic, though, means that there is not a king or a queen. All right, so while Australia is a constitutional monarchy, Sri Lanka does not have a monarchy. So that's one key difference that I can look at straight off the bat. So who has power? This gentleman has power in Sri Lanka. He is the president. This might be a bit rude, me drawing on his face. President Sirisena is his name. He's extremely powerful. Under the Sri Lankan constitution, he has the power to declare war. He has the power to appoint ministers to cabinet. He even has the power to dissolve parliament. He is elected by the people. And is separate to Parliament. But it's not just him who has power. Sorry, I forgot to mention one other power that he has is to declare martial law or emergency law. During a period of emergency law, what the president can do is he can reject any piece of legislation and he can pass any law without going to Parliament. So if he declares this emergency or martial law, Parliament is no longer making laws. So you could easily argue that the president is the most powerful person in Sri Lanka. After the Easter bombings earlier this year, he did declare emergency laws. Yeah, so he's exercised that power very recently. Here's what we call the executive. President's the executive. In Australia, that's very different. The executive is made up of the Governor-General, who represents the Queen. The Prime Minister is also part of the executive and the cabinet ministers. The Governor-General theoretically should be in a similar position to the President, but is not, because of the way that the Australian parliamentary system works. It's the Prime Minister who has the most power. However, it's not that simple. So not only do we have a president in Sri Lanka, we also have the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is democratically elected and he is the head of the parliamentary party that has the most seats in the Sri Lankan Parliament. Okay? So, as we said before, the executive, we have the president in Sri Lanka. We also have the Governor-General in Australia, Prime Minister and Cabinet. The Prime Minister in Sri Lanka is the head of the party with the most seats. And in Australia, this is the same. So one similarity between the two is that the Prime Minister is the leader of the party with the most seats in Parliament. You can see here I'm moving through different branches of power. So the first branch of power I've looked at is the executive, and the second is the legislature, which we're calling the Parliament. One key difference between the parliaments, though, is that the Parliament in Sri Lanka is unicameral, which means there is only one House of Parliament. The Prime Minister has the most seats in this House of Parliament. In Australia, there is two Houses of Parliament, the Upper House and the Lower House, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, this means that the Prime Minister in Sri Lanka has more power than the Prime Minister in Australia, because if Prime Minister of Sri Lanka wants to pass a law, he just has to pass it through one house. If the Prime Minister in Australia wants to pass a law, He has to pass it through this house. Pretty easy because he's got the most votes in this house. Much harder when he gets up to the Senate. He's going to have to compromise. And lastly, similar to Australia, we have the High Court of Sri Lanka, which is fairly independent. So you can see in Sri Lanka, they have a higher Supreme Court, just like Australia. So we do have three bodies of power. One key difference, though, is that in Australia, the Prime Minister and Cabinet are both part of the executive, and they also sit in Parliament. So we don't have a true separation of powers. Whereas in Sri Lanka, the President is independent of Parliament compared to the Prime Minister. Okay. As we know, a quick reintroduction to our Australian parliamentarians. There's ScoMo, just being a regular bloke, as he continually points out, eating a pie. Here is our cabinet, sort of small group, most senior ministers. They're in Parliament. And this is one of our two houses of Parliament, the lower house. So the government has the most seats. Okay, well, where does this power come from? In both Sri Lanka and Australia, there is a constitution. So that's another key similarity. The constitution sets out in both countries the powers of the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. So that is, again, a core similarity between Australia and Sri Lanka. However, it is much easier to change the constitution in Sri Lanka. It's had 20 amendments compared to just 8 changes in Australia. So you could argue that that's a core difference. It's much easier to change the referendum in Sri Lanka. So that's the first place that power comes from. The second place in Sri Lanka, and this is how, again, we can link back to identifying the type of government. This is how we know it's a democracy, is that there are free and fair elections. And there are elections coming up later this year. If you look at one source that I've used is Freedom Watch. There are questions about the amount of violence that takes place around elections in Sri Lanka. However, overall, the results they deem to be credible. Australia has one of the strongest electoral systems in the world. We have an independent body called the Australian Electoral Commission who organises the vote. They're independent of any political party. There's no interference from the government. Okay, so our leaders are clearly democratically elected, as they are in Sri Lanka. There's ScoMo who won this, and poor old Bill Shorten, who's a very sad boy. All right. Another key similarity is that there are lots of freedoms and rights in both countries. However, they are not protected to the same extent. Let's get back to our Venn diagram. Okay, so key similarities we'll look at. Constitution sets out power of the bodies. We also have a similar set out of the executive, legislature, and judiciary. The Prime Minister has a considerable amount of power and is the leader of the party with the most seats. And both are representative democracies. So again, as I'm going through and comparing, I'm looking for the type of government. I'm looking for where power is held. And I'm looking at where that power comes from. They're sort of the core pillars as I identified at the start. And you can do this with any two governments. Core differences, the separation of powers in Sri Lanka